A Minot mother is calling for action from state lawmakers after she says her young son suffered a serious injury at a licensed daycare provider. She says the situation is exposing gaps in North Dakota's child care laws. Kiona Rivera reports on her plans to push for change at the state capitol.
A few weeks ago, Jane McMahon received a message through a communication app from her son's daycare that changed their lives.
That he was injured on the playground, his fingernail was missing, and a good chunk of his skin was missing.
An injury report from North Dakota Human Services states a doctor later determined her toddler was bitten by another child at the facility. McMahon says her one-year-old's fingertip required stitches at the emergency room.
He has no fingernail that was completely removed.
The mother says this was not the first time. A correction order filed by the state in late March said a child had been allowed to be bitten a dozen times before corrective action was taken. We reached out to Midwest Montessori, who said in part, "We are remorseful that a student required stitches to their finger due to an incident that occurred under our care." Midwest Montessori noted that biting is a common behavior among toddlers. In response to the correction order, the provider said it's now tracking behavioral patterns, assigning a staff shadow, and separating children it identifies as persistent biters. But what shocked McMahon the most is what she calls lenient childcare policies implemented by the state, like giving the center 30 to 60 days to correct the issue.
When it's a matter of safety, I don't think that should be an option. I think had correction orders been issued when it was first reported, that this wouldn't have happened to my son.
McMahon plans to testify before the Child Care Services Advisory Committee on April 16th, urging North Dakota to require providers address serious safety violations within 24 hours.
We shouldn't have to choose between going to work or providing safe care for our children.
McMahon's son is recovering and says she's leaving her job to care for her children at home. In Minot, I'm Kiona Rivera, reporting for your news leader.
North Dakota HHS says they cannot release specifics due to confidentiality laws, but take safety concerns at child care facilities seriously. Midwest Montessori, which opened last August, has a Step 1 quality rating with Bright and Early ND, which is the rating system used to assess, improve, and share the quality of early childhood programs across North Dakota. We will have a full statement from leadership with Midwest Montessori in this report on our website.